This boy had an unchanging expression, pain, unable to cry, unable to laugh, because he could not feel what others called emotions. Because of that, the children were all afraid of him, considered him a monster and nicknamed him the ghost of District 17. They did not know that the world of this seemingly innocuous boy was full of color, which was the color of mana. That could be seen by them. That was the reason why he could always exchange food from the giant golem through the exchange of mana-containing waste. This made the group of people who did not work and wanted to eat angry and came to rob things, led by a fat guy named Joe, who had been fed porridge with onions by him and still wanted to use his body to crush people. The 7 guys had their hands full of hot goods. The fat guy with the iron fist fiercely rushed towards him. He could not hit him. He gently turned around and kicked his leg, then punched him to the ground. The gang immediately rushed forward with hot goods in their hands, but his skills were very fast, easily dodging, then knocking down one of them with his elbow. Today, he would make sure they would never come back. In just a moment, he had knocked them all down. The fat guy who had just woken up was even more scared, screaming for his life. No, he immediately pulled out a dagger to dry the blood, but his hand was still shaking. He had violated the unspoken rules of the kids, but he said he had just picked it up by accident. His lie was immediately seen through by him, because he could see the black mana coming out of his heart. It was a color of intense fear. He immediately crippled one of his legs, then he returned home to the damp foot of the bridge. Here, P, the eldest brother of the kids, under the bridge, warmly welcomed him. The kids immediately ran over and hugged him affectionately. They sat around the oil lamp and brought out the meager harvest of food today. Looking at it made one feel sad. After Ngang ate his shit, he immediately brought out his bag full of food, making the children admire him endlessly. His brother was so excited, then P distributed the food to everyone. Everyone was happy, while he quietly went out, because there was not enough food for everyone. A year ago, it was the children who saved his life, when he was buried under the snow. Since then, he has taken care of them to repay the favor of saving his life. He said he was not hungry, but his stomach was protesting. So P broke a small piece of cake in half, and shared it with both of them. The sky was raining heavily. He took the opportunity to bury some food in the warehouse of Area 18. The henchmen were busy gambling and lost. He carefully crawled through the fence, making a hole in the wall to break in. He then collected mana in the air to create a small fire to light up the warehouse, but it looked cool. He secretly thought if he had emotions, could he create a huge fire? Suddenly, a knife flew towards him. He shook his head to the side to avoid it, but it still grazed his ear. He quickly hid to the side, while the guards were shouting loudly, "You little rat, you dare to come and steal. You're faster than I thought." He didn't understand how they discovered him, but after taking a closer look, it turned out that they were equipped with night vision goggles. His position was exposed. 3 daggers were thrown towards him. He quickly rushed forward to avoid the attacks. They were panicking. How could that be possible? He took the opportunity to knock him down with one punch. The other 2 were scared and said, "How could he see us?" His eyes had been glowing since when he saw the angry red mana coming from him. One of them rushed forward to attack, but the daggers couldn't hit him. He could read their movements based on the flow of mana in his body. Next, he fed him the shadowless kick to the face. While the other guy couldn't believe his eyes, a kid could be so strong. With a loud bang, he was instantly defeated, thinking how 3 guys were beaten to a pulp. At first, he still dared to crow. It was really stupid to play anything but stupid to play well. He quickly left but was stopped by a guy with a poke head. He immediately recognized that this poke head was the person running the her organization. That guy was HRY. His eyes became angry. My 3 brothers were beaten to a pulp by a kid. It was really embarrassing, and he felt the terrifying pressure from him. He was lightning fast. His fists were strong as he rushed forward. However, he couldn't make a move. It was like punching a rock. His big hand immediately struck out. Although it was very fast, it still couldn't hit him. He quickly retreated, and even the head of the poke had to admit that he was fast. He had already realized that their strength was not on the same level, and if he received a direct hit, he would be in trouble immediately. The head of the poke rushed forward to attack, but with his skills, he couldn't touch him. He took the opportunity to duck and dodge the attack, then unleashed his hidden card. He gathered his mana into a powerful flame, and hit the guy in the chest. A shocking sound, but it didn't do anything. It turned out that the attack just now was just for show so he could escape. The head poked and received the fire. He was very angry, shouting loudly, "Where are you guys? It hasn't run far yet. Hunt it down for me." The scene became chaotic. They were frantically searching for him. At this rate, he couldn't escape. He threw a stone to alert the main gate and lured him out, while he himself slipped into the forest. If he was caught, this day next year, he would be sitting on the altar inhaling incense and smoke. Moreover, he still had to take care of the children to repay the favor of saving his life. He kept running until he felt his body starting to weaken. He stopped by the tree to catch his breath, frowning as he tried to determine the direction, but this time luck didn't smile on him. A guard discovered him and shouted loudly, "There it is." He turned his head in surprise, silently saying that it was no use. He continued running, heading towards the darkest part of the path, through the dense bushes. As he ran, his steps suddenly slowed down, reaching a dead end. Then damn it, how did you hit so quickly? One of the guards in the group of people chasing him saw his figure, standing straight in front. Another saw the barbed wire fence taller than a person and sneered, "Hey, there's no way to run." These guys started to draw their weapons. They held sharp daggers, sneering and threatening. "Tell me what you stole, or I'll poke a hole in your stomach." He glanced at the fierce group of people in front of him, but what he cared about was that without Hume, he could win. If he had to face that big man, he would still be afraid, but with these skinny guys, he still had a chance to escape. He turned around, ready his fist, red mana streams continuously swirling around his clenched fist until it turned white. One of them rushed forward angrily, his eyes wide open, shouting, "Are you deaf?" He stabbed at him with a knife, but he quickly dodged. The knife's path went astray, causing him to kill himself. He grabbed his opponent's arm and suddenly threw a strong punch. The other guy was knocked down immediately, blood spurting out of his nose. The other saw their teammate being knocked down and shouted angrily, "You bastard!" One of them rushed forward, but before he could make a move, he grabbed his wrist. A hot stream from his hand seemed to burn him. He broke it, and the knife in his hand fell down. Feeling his strength, he trembled and cursed continuously. Why is he so strong? He didn't pay any attention. His other hand condensed yellow energy, like lightning. In his shock and confusion, he threw a punch accompanied by lightning energy. At this point, the guy only had time to scream miserably before collapsing, his head and shoulders scorched. He thought he was done, but from afar, he heard a shout. "Over there! There's a sound over there!" The situation was getting more and more dangerous. He quickly picked up the fallen knife as a weapon for self-defense. Hearing footsteps behind him, he gritted his teeth and couldn't stop thinking, "I can't use magic forever." In the moment of crisis, he glanced behind and found a box of horns. When the guards chased him to the scene, he had already cleaned it up, causing them to ignore this place. He heard shouts from afar, "Damn it, where is it? Don't lose track." After a while, the outside gradually became quiet. He breathed a sigh of relief. The footsteps were far away. Looking around at the pitch-black night, he thought to himself, "I bet you guys can't catch me." But this wasn't the first time he had slept in a 1,000 Stars hotel like this. Lying among the bags of horns, he was still alert, holding the knife tightly in his hand. If he followed me across the bridge, the kids would be in danger. A group of people outside were screaming and chasing him. As the night went on, the rain fell even heavier. He was exhausted now. The sound of pouring rain outside made his eyelids even heavier, and then he fell asleep. The next day, the rain from last night had stopped, but the sky was still gloomy, with thick black clouds. He also had a peaceful night. When the faint sunlight filtered through the gap in the trash can lit, the teenager inside slowly woke up. "I fell asleep. There must be no one else." He guessed so when it had been quiet outside for a long time. He immediately opened the lid and jumped out. As soon as he touched the ground, he was startled when he heard a voice saying, "Found it." In front of him, a man wearing a security guard approached, his hand hidden behind his back, tightly holding a knife. He sneered, "Luckily I came back." The knife in his hand was raised in front of him, ready to stab him, but in his eyes, in front of this man's chest, a red stream of air was constantly rotating. He saw red, and immediately realized that he was extremely angry. He also held the knife tightly in his hand, preparing for battle, but secretly thought that he had not fully recovered. Seeing that the rope also held a knife, his anger increased, and his face became crazy. He gritted his teeth. "Why do you have a knife too? How manly?" Then he jumped up, rushing towards the rope. "Then I don't need to hold back anymore." He ran while grinning. D also raised his knife, the blade pointing straight out. When the other guy slashed down, the rope quickly dodged. He missed, and his anger grew even more. The anger increased his speed. The more he dodged, the more he stabbed, causing the rope to lean back. The knife didn't hit him, but a few strands of silver hair were cut off, falling in front of the rope. He was a little panicked, losing his balance, and the other side saw that he was about to fall, so they rushed over. Duong's hand was high, the knife was sharp, and his face had a strange smile. "Goodbye, oh boy." Seeing that he was about to be stabbed, but there was no fear on the wire, only 1 centimeter away. Suddenly a gunshot rang out. The birds were startled and flew away. Dee's face was gloomy, his eyebrows were furrowed, his handsome face was stained with fresh blood. He was still sitting silently on the ground, next to the body of the guard. Everything from just now happened in the blink of an eye. The boundary between life and death was so fragile. Dee slowly stood up, walked towards the man standing in front. His face was still in the same shooting position. Neos raised his head slightly, looked at him, and smiled. "The muzzle of the gun just fired, still emitting that dangerous shadow," the wire said. Then the man lit a cigarette. Neos took a drag and exhaled the smoke. One hand held the cigarette, the other hand put the gun back in the holster on the side. When he finished, he put both hands in his pants pocket, raised his head and looked at the wire from head to toe, confirmed that there was no injury, and then laughed. "What are you doing this early in the morning?" The man was Neos, the 17th Street boss. Neo stepped forward and warned, "Die. It's dangerous." He raised his bloody face and looked at him, asking, "Who called you? Do you usually wake up this early?" He answered briefly, "Yeah." Neos chuckled and reminded, "I heard that some guys from Hector are hanging around here." He was the one in the M7th Street boss, and glanced at D, who was hugging the cans tightly in his shirt, then let it go. "Ask the kid where he got those things from." Then he laughed heartily. "You're quite brave." D looked at him and said, "Thank you, uncle," bowing slightly, looking helpless. "No compliments." D continued, "It's really difficult." He looked up at Neos, thinking that someone like Neos was very difficult to deal with. He looked at Neos, who was puffing on a cigarette, and continued to think. People like him are so emotionally dull that they can never fill their tanks. Neos said, "It's easy to die like this. Not everyone can move." D, still with a cold gaze, replied, "If we don't do it, we'll all starve to death." Neos raised his hand to stroke his hair and said, "Well, I've already repaid you for saving me." D interrupted, I pulled you up because I thought you were a tool, but I didn't intend to save you. Neo smiled wryly. Never mind. You saved me anyway. The rope continued, and you've already repaid me. He thought back to about a year ago. I happened to pull Neo's up from the river. It seemed like he used to be the manager of District 46 but was betrayed. I don't think he lied about that. The way he taught me to fight to repay him was quite methodical. Thinking about it, he called Neo's. Neo's was putting out his cigarette with his foot, and when he heard the call, he replied, what? The rope said his proposal. I will join your organization. He thought that if he joined his organization, the children would be safe. Neo's looked at him with a thoughtful look. Then he turned around, walked away, leaned against the pillar, and called the rope. You asked the kid if he could use magic, right? This sentence surprised the rope a bit. You know magic? Neo smiled slyly. Indeed. I thought I was mistaken when he lit a fire without a lighter. The rope followed behind and asked, Come, what do I hear you know about magic? He continued to smile and replied, I only know a little because I asked a magician from the previous organization. Do you still have mana to use magic, and is mana in the air? Only a few people can identify and use mana. Then, the rope raised his eyes and asked again, Did they say anything about color? Neo's quickly said, No. They also said that mana cannot be seen with the naked eye. Hearing this, the rope looked up at the sky and thought to himself, So, what am I seeing? He frowned, looked at Neo's, and said, Is that all? Did you forget something? If you don't want to get punched? Neo swung his fist at the rope but missed, and both of them became more childish. Neo's raised his voice. This naughty boy. The rope just gently replied, Thank you, Neo's. Continuing the story, he did it on purpose, right? Both of them quickly returned to their serious expressions. The rope crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, then asked, What about my request? Neo simply replied, No. Hearing this, the rope immediately asked, Why did you suddenly refuse? Neo's raised his head to look at the sky, his face filled with contemplation. He told him, In the small towns along the Elton River, where the settlements stretch along the water upstream, people will encounter other areas where they can escape from the nest to seek new opportunities. Neo's thought about the wire's bright face and secretly calculated, it would be such a pity if a child with so much potential died here. Neo's looked at the wire, the corners of his lips slightly raised. Let me ask you, have you ever thought about leaving District 50? I can get you a car. The wire replied, No, uncle. I still have to take care of the children here. Neo smiled and said happily, Don't worry, I've thought about building an orphanage here. The wire was surprised and asked back, Orphanage? Neo's patted the wire's head, smiled and added, Yes, I will accept orphans like you, so they won't have to wander the streets anymore. The wire looked at Neo's chest, in the slightly gray air. He thought to himself, What a dream. I don't know if it's true, but it must be true, even though it's not certain. The wire still decided to trust Neo's. His heart thought softly, he always keeps his word. Suddenly remembering something, the wire said, Be careful. It seems like he's preparing for war. The wire continued, I saw him receive several trucks full of weapons. Neo's lazily replied, I know. The wire cried softly, Firing a gun in any dispute is like a declaration of war. The second continued, The people in the store will suffer a lot. If you lose, I think the protection fee is reasonable. Neo's was a little annoyed, saying, That's because there are many people who look worse than me. But then he looked down at the rope, reminding, But don't act like me. I don't even have a wife. The rope replied helplessly, You're old. Neo's was angry, about to hit the rope again, but he quickly dodged. A man drove up, looked at Neo's, and said, The boss, it's time to go. Neo's replied solemnly, Okay, let's go. The man respectfully opened the door for Neo's. He got into the car, his words echoed behind him. This place is about to become a battlefield. You should find a place to stop. He threw something behind him and said, Take this. The rope skillfully caught it. In his hand was a small glass tube with a blue cross printed on it. The rope asked, What is this? Neo sat in the car, pointed at his hand, and said, Clean your hands. The rope watched the car drive away, his pale eyes filled with contemplation. The fog was thick, the town mixed with smoke and the howling wind, creating a gray scene. 17th Street, near the Central Square. Joss sat next to Viola, on the side of the road. Suddenly someone walked over. Rose's eyes lit up, said, Di. Jose happily ran over, asked, Why didn't you come back yesterday? Looking at Di, his whole body was dusty and scratched, he exclaimed, Why are you in such a mess? Joss tightly held the strap of his bag, bleeding, said, Hick, did you fight? Who did that? Di slightly grabbed his cloak, looked and said, Nothing, I just fell. Jose sobbed, his chest radiated a bright circle. He said in sobs, It must hurt a lot. Di thought to himself, How can a person have so many emotions at the same time? Di patted Jose's head, gently comforted him, took it, and went back to the front tent, went to tell P that he would be there soon. Jose gradually stopped crying, looked up at him with tearful eyes, and softly replied, Yes. Having said that, Jose hurriedly walked away, leaving only the rope and Viola. The rope did not turn back and spoke. Viola, did you tell Jose anything? The white-haired woman sitting on the side of the road said softly. Dee? She was just telling stories about rainbows. It was Viola, the blind storyteller. The rope turned back to look at her and coldly replied, Don't tell children those stories. If you keep telling them nonsense, they won't be able to forget real life. Viola just smiled gently. Children need to know how to dream. In the rope's eyes, a purple light flashed. He wondered in his heart. What are emotions? Viola's chest emitted a sparkling purple light, attracting his curiosity. Purple mana, I've never seen anyone other than Viola with this color. The rope turned away and coldly said, You should move to another street. War is about to break out. He quickly walked away, leaving Viola sitting there, thinking to herself, what a kind child. The next morning, the bright sunlight filtered through the roof. Day knocked on the door and said, Delivery. Neo opened the door and saw him, saying, Oh, is that Day? The fat guy said he would take care of the delivery. Day replied coldly, Really? He secretly objected in his heart. It would be a long time before he had his leg broken by him. He put the wooden crate in the house and continued, Aren't you going to evacuate? If war breaks out, there won't be any customers here. Neo was calm but helpless. If we leave the store, where else can we go? Suddenly, Neo spoke, but it was not certain that there would be a war. Day looked up and asked, What do you mean? Neo pointed to the door of Hector and Neo's. Neo's was talking inside. If the latch worked, there would be no war. The iron door opened, and Hector, HPR, and a man with half his face covered by hair walked out. It was the same street as 18. Hector and Neo bowed their heads respectfully, shyly. Hector looked at the rope and said, A little boy working. All the adults have run away. He patted the rope on the shoulder and said, Good job, kid. Work hard, and that's the only way to survive. He put a few coins in his hand, took the money to buy some snacks. Then he walked away, calling out to the others before leaving a sentence. Let's fly. The rope looked at the coins in his hand, and was silent. Suddenly, HPR saw something. His eyes became cold. Discovering the bandage on the rope's ear, feeling it, the rope tensed up. He pulled the hood of his cloak over his ears, warily thinking that he recognized him. He frowned and stared but did not say anything. Suddenly a voice called out, What are you doing outside, Hamher? H replied, I'll be right there. The car sped away, leaving behind dust and smoke. New breathed a sigh of relief. You're leaving. Rope pulled down his cloak hood, thinking. He noticed the wound on my hand. Why did he leave without saying anything? Nisu walked into the shop, asked Neos. What happened? Looking at Neos' appearance, Nisu was startled. Neos sat on the cargo box, his face tense. The negotiation failed. His face became unpleasant, preparing for war. Nu was afraid, stammering. Really? Neos hugged his forehead. I can't accept such unreasonable terms. They want to take over our organization. This is really the worst result. Nu comforted. It's not your fault. Neos turned to instruct. Don't leave your hideout for a while. On the old stone path, Rope put his hands in his pockets, thinking as he walked. I won't be able to walk if war breaks out. His eyes turned cold, and he thought to himself, I need to get as much food as possible before that happens. The black car passed by, attracting his attention. The driver was a bald man, which made him unconsciously think of the name HRY. He followed the car, filled with suspicion. I have never seen such a car in the 50th district. This is really suspicious. HRY pulled up the hem of his coat, looked up, and thought to himself, I need to investigate. He quietly followed the car going to 18th Street, the entrance to the organization. H and a few people respectfully bowed their heads before the luxurious car. HRY hid in the grass, wondering who it was. The car door opened, her approached, and said, We have been waiting in the car. A man wearing a monocle, dressed neatly, stepped out with a welcoming voice. We will escort you inside, Your Excellency. The Vine hid in the bushes, silently observing who he was. He saw a dark blue color raging from his chest cavity, like a black hole in the universe. The Vine silently calculated. The dark blue was almost black, a ridiculous amount of mana. That color looked like the mana of golems when they moved. He stared at his mana pool, full of doubts. What were those circles around his container? The dark blue circles were crisscrossed, radiating a great power all around. Those circles also had a lot of mana, as if he was using them to keep the mana from escaping. The Vine was silent, thinking to himself, That man is very dangerous. I need to tell Neos. A moment later, on 17th Street, the Neos organization moved the crates of weapons down from the truck. One by one, they greeted each other. The people inside were hurriedly moving the weapons, exchanging words. What happened to the supplies? Another person pointed. Hurry up and move. The wire found a man and asked, Where's Neos? Seeing him, the man was startled. How did you get in? The wire replied vaguely. The gate was open. The man looked at him helplessly. This brat. Then, the wire continued to ask, Anyway, where's Neos? The man waved his hand. The boss has gone out to prepare for war. It's dangerous, so you should go too. The wire calmly said. Then tell this to Neos. The man immediately asked back. What? But the wire thought to himself that he couldn't tell him about mana. These words rang out solemnly. Tell him to be wary of the man wearing a monocle. In an old, desolate area, the gray air spread throughout every corner. A figure walked over, looking at the children sleeping soundly on the ground, blankets covered together. A voice said, The war cannot last. Sitting next to him, P continued. But don't you think it will end in a week? The two people sat there whispering to each other. Ballet spoke up. Who do you think will win? Ballet replied, I don't know. The two organizations are quite evenly matched. He bowed his head slightly and thought, but Neos must win for the safety of the children. He was tensely thinking about taking care of the children here. If he won this war, the street children would be sold into slavery. Ballet looked at the wall in front of him and softly said, The war must have begun. Suddenly, a noise made both of them pale and tense. The rope stood up immediately. Ballet asked, "Did you hear that?" The rope quickly replied, "Yes." B said, "I've never heard anything like this before." The whole rope tensed up, eyes wide open, calculating. It was strange, something was wrong. On 17th Street, the soldiers with tense faces were firing forward. Suddenly, something made them terrified. The golem with beads of sweat still on its face appeared before them. Its eyes were shining brightly, standing tall, unscathed by the recent barrage of bullets. One of them cursed. "What the hell?" It didn't even leave a dent. The comrade beside him spoke up. "What's wrong with this golem all of a sudden?" Suddenly, the golem raised its hand. A blue-black power radiated from its hand. The enormous power surged up, rolling forward like a hurricane. The powerful firepower caused the comrade beside him to lose half of his body. He cried out in panic. "What the hell?" The golem's eyes were shining brightly but lifeless, not revealing any emotion. Its stone fingers slowly tightened around the man, making him unable to move or utter a curse. With a decisive move, the golem pulled the man's body in half. Blood splattered into the air, covering the destroyer's body. The monocle-wearing man spoke with a cold, disdainful expression. "It smells like fried sticks." Meanwhile, the T-soldier beside him trembled, his lips tightly sealed in fear. The golem, covered in blood, turned back to stand before the bespectacled man. He looked at it with a satisfied smile. "That's right, my masterpiece." His expression was dangerous as he ordered, "Clean up everything here." On the other side, the rope and P were still standing by the wall. P spoke. "The sound is getting louder." Seeing the rope leave, Ballet quickly grabbed his hand. "Walk. Where are you going?" "This is different from usual." Ballet was worried and resolutely said, "If you're going, let me go with you." He looked at Paula and calmly replied, "No. Paula, you wait here." Suddenly, a child came out of the collapsed hut, startling both of them. The child spoke. "Why is everyone still awake?" Ballet returned to his calm state, gently patting the child. "Sorry, we woke you up. We'll be back inside soon, so go back to sleep." The boy just calmly replied, "Okay." Dee stood behind Paulo, softly calling, "Pale." Before the rope could say anything more, Ballet spoke up. "Okay, Ballet. I'll stay here with the kids." Ballet put both hands on his shoulders, saying, "Don't go too far and come back when you know what's going on." Ballet calmly replied, "Okay." He added, "I'll be back soon." Ballet walked to the battlefield, where corpses were strewn across the ground with blood, and smoke and fire were billowing everywhere. Walking slowly, Ballet walked through the pool of blood, stood in front of a man, and spoke. "What happened here?" A voice calling Ballet startled him. Ballet hurriedly asked, "Are you okay? What happened?" The man hurriedly said, "Those bastards brought a golem." With only half of his body left, he still had a weak life force, using the last bit of strength to shout. The man with the monocle has taken control. His eyes gradually dimmed, his voice weak and intermittent. "We don't have enough strength to resist." The man slowly fell backwards, not forgetting to remind, "Run." His arm lost its strength and fell to the cold ground. The rope stood silently in the midst of the smoke and fire, looking at the man who had completely lost his life. His heart suddenly sank. Without saying anything, he reached out to touch the man's mouth. Then, he bent down to pick up a small knife from the ground. He looked at the number of dead people lying on the ground, and he realized in his heart, at this rate, Neos' group would lose. Day tightly held the knife in his hand, his eyes determined. "I need to help Neos." At the same time on the bridge, the rain was still pouring down, the stream was pouring down. The two boys hugged each other tightly, blood covering both of them. Many other children lay on the ground, blood soaking their bodies. Ballet hugged the smaller child tightly in his arms, P.E.'s face covered in blood. He looked up with a lifeless gaze. The merciless golem was about to rush towards him and the child. Ballet could only helplessly call out weakly, "Day." Ballet closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks, saying to himself, "Don't come back here." At this time, Da was at 17th Street, the downtown area. When Day arrived, it was already too late. There were already many people who had died or perished here. Day sighed. "Looks like I'm too late." He looked around at all the corpses there. The corpses here were all from Neos. Even though he had searched very carefully, Day could not find Neos' body anywhere. He thought to himself that he was probably still alive, sitting to observe the situation. Suddenly, a loud explosion rang out behind Rope, making him jump. Rope vaguely turned his head in that direction very quickly. Then, Rope ran quickly towards the place where the explosion came from. At this moment, the air there was extremely stuffy. Thick smoke rose up along with drizzle. Rope stopped here. He looked around, observed for a while, his mouth panting because he was too tired from running. At this moment, a huge golem appeared here. The explosion just now was also from it. Beside it were the children's dismembered corpses. Rope's face immediately darkened. "I must kill you." Rope jumped straight into the air with a dagger in his hand, rushing forward. Fuck it. But very quickly the golem with glowing red eyes discovered him. Without hesitation, the golem rushed towards the wire, throwing a powerful punch. The punch was so strong that the wire was thrown far away, hitting the wall, creating a large dent, and causing rocks to fly everywhere. The wire was seriously injured, breathing with difficulty, but still turned to the children. "I have to check if they're okay." Suddenly, he saw the scene of the child caretaker happily welcoming him back like every day. The wire turned around to see the children running towards him, their faces beaming. They shouted, "Brother Wire, hurry up." The wire stood still listening to everyone's calls and concern. However, suddenly P said, Day, we don't want you to come back. The wire suddenly realized that it was all just an illusion from his memory. The painful reality was right before his eyes, calling the children's names. Lauren, Lena,
Budon,
Mile,
Josephine.
come to P. But no one answered. All were murdered, their bodies covered in mud and blood. The rope trembled and reached forward, shouting, No! He collapsed, choking. I still haven't paid you back. Suddenly a strange sound rang out. The rope recognized it as the sound of the golem in battle. He recalled the horrifying scene. Dead bodies everywhere, the children in the basement, and everyone in the street. The rope gritted his teeth, determined to avenge everyone. The people looked straight at the golem, telling himself to move even though his body was seriously injured. He trembled and retreated, praying for it to move. Day's eyes widened as he stared into the endless void. The golem was about to move forward to crush Day. At that moment, a car rushed forward and hit the golem. Neos appeared, big or small. Is Day okay? He ran towards Day to check his body and sighed in relief. Luckily, there were no broken bones. Rope scratched the ground, his voice trembling as he called Neos. He choked up. The Neos children stood there, dumbfounded, understanding the situation, his hands clenched, bowing his head. Day apologized for being too late. Rope shook his head. It wasn't his fault. Neos hugged Rope to comfort him. Rope leaned against the wall and asked Neos what about his subordinates. Neos calmly replied, they were all dead. He secretly blamed that bastard Hector, but he didn't expect him to call the sorcerer from outside. Dee asked more. What are you going to do? Neos replied, I'll go back and find survivors. Now Hector. Before he could finish, the magic bullet pierced through Neos' body. Dee looked at the wound on Neos' body in panic, shouting, Neos! Neos! Spitting out a mouthful of blood, he laughed coldly. Huh, damn it. Rope quickly supported Neos' body as he fell. Blood had already been flowing. Carving his hand, Rope shook Neos' body, calling Neos' name. He couldn't believe his eyes. What happened? Just now he was standing here talking about his future plans. Dee recalled the old memories of Neos teaching him martial arts, grilling meat, and drinking together. Dee even remembered how Neos called his name. But now, everything was gone. It was all because of this golem. A fire of anger flared up in his heart, his eyes filled with anger, shouting loudly, I will kill all of you. The golem's cold eyes turned towards Day, ready to attack. The golem stretched out its hand, its power like a tornado. Day also raised his hand covered in blood, the determination to take revenge burning in his heart. The two sources of power collided. The golem calmly used its strength. While Day tried his best, the fire of hatred in him burning fiercely. The battle was extremely fierce. Neither of them would give in. Day thought to himself, I am different from you. I am human. I have emotions. He used all his strength to attack back. The powerful fire, like a tornado, struck towards the golem. It was immediately crushed into hundreds of pieces. The magic was so powerful that even the ground was burned to a crisp. In the end, Day successfully avenged everyone. Dee stood still, his face cold as money, observing the scene. Around him, he sat down, hugged Neos, shook his uncle, his voice trembling. Neos! Neos, wake up. Day did not dare to believe the truth. He still tried to convince himself that Neos could not die. At that moment, Neos woke up, his voice full of fatigue. This brat is in pain. Neos helplessly gave up and said indifferently, even though I knew I wouldn't die, Yanbin was fine, but I didn't think it would be today. A thought flashed through Neos' mind. I have achieved too much from someone at the bottom of the food chain. Neos had always wondered if he had suffered a little more. Would things have been different? No, that question was difficult to answer. Neos looked at Day and suddenly realized. That's right. It was at this age, Day hurriedly wanted to go get medicine but was stopped by him. This body has reached its limit. Neos advised Day. You should leave this place. Try to say your last words. You should leave this place, go to a better place. I have always considered you as a little brother. It's a pity that I can't be by your side to take care of you anymore. Then Neos advised. Swim upstream, Day. Don't let the rapids sweep you away. Neos smiled brightly, encouraging Day that he would do it. Before he died, he still struggled to give Dee the car key that he had prepared for him. Then his arm gradually lost its vitality and fell down. Day stared blankly at his empty hand, then looked down at Neos' body. His whole body was covered in blood. Excited, his eyes wide open, he screamed and sobbed. What were his emotions at that moment? Anger and despair. Those were the emotions that Day felt for the first time. He sat there, not moving anywhere. It was morning. The sunlight shone on the corner of Day's face. He painfully woke up after a night of terror. Day looked at his hand, feeling like everything just now was just a long dream. He painfully recalled his emotions, and they were just as chaotic as before. Day closed his eyes, feeling that there must be something else. The fire in his hand suddenly flared up and burned fiercely. Day looked at the fire, suddenly understanding. The angrier he was, the stronger the fire became. So, his emotions affected his magical power.